Did New Jersey flood a town which remains intact and underwater to this day, ready to emerge like the lost city of Atlantis? No. Thanks for watching. Just kidding. But in researching this urban legend, I stumbled across the real world events that illustrate some of the worst and best elements of humanity. A story that is at the same time harrowing, inspiring, tragic, but with consequences that are still felt today. If that, mixed with a hefty dash of thalassophobia, sounds like your kind of bag, then let's begin. Welcome, you dashing dudes and dames, to another installment of Words and Coffee, where we enjoy a cup of small batch roasted goodness and talk interesting history about the Garden State. Today is a dark Italian roast from Invader Coffee Company. And the history is the flooded town of Old Boonton. Let's get to it. Many states are blessed with a certain baseline level of weirdness. Certain places or people develop a kind of reputation, earned over countless years for being uniquely memorable in some kind of way. Acre for acre, New Jersey claims an abundance of eerie and interesting folklore. Located just off the I-287 freeway is what appears to be an otherwise unassuming lake. It's downstream of a picturesque waterfall that's worthy of an afternoon's visit, but all in all, it's a body of water much like any other. What makes this one unique is not just the fact that it is artificial, but beneath these waters is allegedly the site of the village of Old Boonton. Such a description immediately conjures up images of a drowned city, fully intact and ready to emerge once again. Fact checks rules this mostly true, and that's the version that I was told as a freshman many years ago. The modern legend deviates wildly from reality, and it goes something like this. In 1904, the town of Old Boonton was evacuated to make way for a new reservoir. The school, the mill, whole houses were abandoned overnight. Some families left everything behind. All except for one old man who had nowhere else to go and so stayed behind in the church. When they sealed off the dam, the town started to flood, and he was trapped there as the water swallowed him up. And to this day, whenever there's a drought, some say you can still see the top of the church spire, as if trying to climb its way out of its watery grave. Despite being fantastical, macabre, not to mention wholly false, the myth of a whole town underwater has a certain romance to it. And so, despite having actual pictures of the lake bottom from several droughts, the most recently of which was in 1980, the legend persists to this day. Now, if that was the whole story, we wouldn't be here. Believe it or not, there is actually just a smidgen of truth to this story. While the land and buildings were systematically demolished and cleared over a multi-year period, including some 45 private homes, a paper mill, and a factory which dated back to the Revolutionary War, that is not to say it was a wholly benign process. This was a town, people lived there. Even before the builders set the first block of stone, there would be a human toll. Our story goes back to 1891. Jersey City is in the midst of a typhoid outbreak, a real life horror story if there ever was one, and its reliance on the Passaic River is no longer tenable. I guess you could say that sewage treatment in those days was pretty crappy. The search for a new and reliable water supply was on. As dictated by the needs of geographic proximity and fluid mechanics, a number of sites in North Jersey were considered before Old Boonton was ultimately chosen. As the village already had a habit of flooding, this seemed to make it an ideal choice. Problem is, they neglected to tell the residents about their plan. More on that later. Now, converting a river into a lake is not an unusual practice. In New Jersey, this was actually done in a few other locations, including the Round Valley Reservoir, which is similar in many ways to Boonton. Shown here is one of several videos on YouTube, which I encourage you to check out. However, right from the start, there were questionable business practices. Around 1894, representatives from Jersey City began making unscheduled visits for impromptu surveys. Essentially, they showed up unannounced and started evaluating the watersheds, rivers, and related areas for what suited their purposes. After some time, the locals started to notice all these suits taking an undue interest in the rivers and watersheds, and so they started asking questions. Again, to reiterate, this was meant to be done quietly, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. They didn't call up the mayor and state their intentions. They just kind of rolled in and expect everything to fall in line when the time came.
I'm just gonna assume it all went to plan, what?
As was the case in my Jersey Devil video, the urban-rural divide tends to come up as a recurring theme. For the locals, this was going to be a disruption, and not necessarily a beneficial one. Imagine handing over 800 acres of your town to make a lake which you yourself are not allowed to use. Reading old newspaper clippings, I get the sense that there was a bit of a bait and switch at work. On the one hand, this was pitched to the residents as what would become a picturesque natural area, and what they got were trespassing charges. But a few years go by, and most people forget about those suits from the city. Until one day, unannounced, a man by the name of Michael J. Kennedy showed up and started buying up properties. At first, the residents assumed he was a farmer, considering his interest in, well, farms. But then they noticed some odd things. For instance, he was reluctant to provide a name, notably refusing to register with the hotel that he was staying at. This went on for most of a summer. Despite playing things low key, the residents started to notice that he was making offers on everyone's farms.
What do you mean, everyone?
It was only later that they realized he was a representative of P.H. Flynn, the owner of the Jersey City Water Company, which ultimately won the bid. A single organization buying up large tracts of land through a straw buyer and misrepresented intentions. I sure hope that never happens again. So I feel this is a good time to point out some of the major players here. 1. We have the Jersey City municipal government. Elected officials have to answer to the voting public why the water is so shitty. Okay, that's the last one, promise. Serious though, 1 in 1,000 are suffering from typhoid at this point. I think those of us living in the modern era can fully appreciate how weird things get when public health is involved. 2. The Jersey City Water Company, owned by P.H. Flynn. He was one of several companies bidding for the rights to build the dam and manage the water. This was a lucrative contract. $8 million in the early 1900s would be equivalent to about $250 million today. Even after Flynn won the contract and the dam was completed, several years behind schedule, the city was involved with several lawsuits among bidders who didn't win. With this amount of money at stake, people get weird. Which brings us to 3. The residents themselves. To say this was a divisive issue doesn't come close. At the time, the population of Boonton was 3,300 people. At its peak, the water company employed 1,500, most of those brought in from out of town. Thus, you increase the population of the town by half again. That's a lot. On the one hand, this was a boom time for anyone with a boarding house, a hotel, or a store of any kind. A lot of money was about to come into town, along with a lot of men who were young and dumb and full of energy. Mostly that was fine for the shop owners who stood to profit, but what of the property owners who were about to be literally underwater? Well, I might be willing to sell. How much you got? And now we see why Flynn might have seen the benefit to keeping things discreet. If he makes an offer on your house and you know there's a $250 million contract behind it, you might think to ask for more. And this fear was not unfounded. By the time they were ready to break ground in 1899, Flynn had only managed to secure 3 of the 46 properties that he needed. And 3 years later, in 1902, when construction was well underway, there still remained a few holdouts who didn't want to sell, or rather, not for the price that he was willing to offer. In addition to the private farms, Old Boonton was home to a gristmill, a school, a church, and the Mars County Almshouse, aka the Mars County Poorhouse. It was this charitable organization that was located at what is presently the Reservoir's Island. Precise dates are spotty, but the almshouse may date back to 1837 when the county government purchased farm property where the charity would ultimately be established. It wasn't perfect, but its mission was an admirable one. Decent housing and food for the poor, and funded by the government, was pretty remarkable for those days.
Shall we continue to build palace after palace for the rich? Or shall we aspire to a more noble purpose and build decent housing for the poor? How does the Senate vote? Fuck the poor! Good.
They even made an effort at self-sustenance by encouraging the inmates, their words, to participate in farming and production of basic tools on the premises. This was to supplement their county funding and was noted by the Board of Freeholders during their annual inspections. All in all, things were running about as well as could be expected. It was considered far more humane than the other way of dealing with poverty. As late as the 1870s, towns dealt with impoverished residents through the once common practice of pauper auctions. That is, one living in poverty could acquire food, clothing, and shelter by accepting bids in exchange for household or agricultural work on behalf of their benefactor,
That just sounds like slavery with extra steps!
a kind of indentured servitude. According to the History of Morris County, written in 1882, the almshouse sheltered hundreds of destitute individuals, including the very young, the very old, and many with psychiatric issues. Unfortunately, it also happened to reside on the land about to be flooded. And as we've already established,
Fuck the poor!
kidding aside, these occupants were relocated to the Morris County Children's Home or Greystone Asylum as their needs dictated. As to the latter, Greystone is a topic worthy of its own video, and I fully intend to make one. Now, remember when I mentioned sketchy business practices? Flynn's representative, Michael J. Kennedy, used a shell company and represented himself as a property developer. In this way, he made a bid to purchase the almshouse and surrounding farm in 1898, a bid which the Board of Freeholders accepted, citing the fact that the facility was a net drain of resources and Kennedy's bid was far above the market rate. Imagine that. Shady property deals. In New Jersey. Now, spooky exaggerations aside, all inmates were moved prior to demolition, all except for about 200 residents who could not simply pick up and go, that is, not without a shovel. Behind the old almshouse was a cemetery. After the sale of the property was completed in 1899, there was some debate over how and indeed if these remains were to be exhumed and reinterred. This is where at least one of the more lurid stories about the reservoir may be based on a kernel of truth. However, it does kind of beg the question whether Jersey City was drinking literal graveyard water. I mean, it was still polluted, but no. The bodies were relocated in May of 1903. Alexander Forsyth was part of an 80-man team that dug up the bodies on the almshouse property. They were then reinterred at the farm of Joseph Steventon on nearby Parsippany Boulevard. Sketchy business practices aside, Flynn did pay for the relocation, so credit where it's due. However, over time you could see where Charity House could have morphed into church and Cemetery Hill could have morphed into bell tower. And thus, the legend is born. It's this interaction between the facts and the rumor mill that give birth to these local legends, and I am all for it. While the visual of gravestones resting on the silty bottom make for a potently macabre, albeit fictitious image, as does the idea of a man trapped inside a flooding building, it does not change the fact that the dangerous work either killed or gravely injured over a dozen men. Between the dam itself and the nearby quarry at Hog Mountain, the Jersey City Water Company would employ up to 1,500 men. They worked with no standardized approach to safety and were often immigrants whose grasp on a common language was not always reliable. This next part's kind of rough, so you've been warned. June 1899. James Antonio, an Italian worker, was crushed to death at the quarry. May 1900. Prasters Francisco, another quarry worker, was thrown by a derrick. That's one of these crane-looking things. Two separate non-fatal incidents that same month where two men fell 30 feet off of the quarry train trestle. July 1901, another death, this time due to heat exhaustion. In a separate incident, a charge of dynamite was overloaded, resulting in a building destroyed, but thankfully no one was injured that time. Followed a month later by another bad fall. Alexander Farmer of Hoboken, thankfully he recovered. Still in 1901, an Armenian man named Herbert Joseph lost his leg. For many, that would be a career ender, but they were built tougher back then, and he came back to work as a signalman. November 1902 had two separate incidents. A man named Frank Sassone was... yeah, that's graphic. So, the big metal cogwheels on a mixer... anyway, he lost his legs. And then after he lost his legs, he fell 20 feet to the ground. So, yeah, horrible. This next one wasn't a work-related injury. I'm going to count it anyway because it was likely motivated by friction between the Boonton residents and the workers. That same month, a Hungarian worker got shot walking home. Dr. J.L. Taylor extracted the bullet, and he thankfully lived. I think Dr. Taylor was employed by the water company since his name comes up again later, but I wasn't able to verify that, so take it with a grain of salt. 1903 was a bad year. In February, a 31-year-old Italian man named Anastacio de Torse died when he was thrown from a dumping bucket and landed on his head. Then in May, Herbert Joseph again, the Armenian guy, he got hit by the swinging boom of another derrick crane and died on the spot. In July, a man fell from the dam, injuring his leg. October, the rope holding a rock elevator at the quarry snapped and crashed on 3 Italian laborers, fracturing their skulls and sending them to the hospital. April 1904, James Cullen was injured when he was working on a boiler and the pressure gauge exploded. That same month, Peter Zinni was killed in another derrick accident at the quarry. However, it is the other incident which occurred in April of 1904, which may be the original inspiration for the story about the man in the flooded church. On the 11th of April 1904, the dam was complete and the start of official service was just weeks away. However, there was one final operation that needed to be done, involving one of the low-level outlet valves. This was a means of controlling the dam's water level, kind of like the drain on a bathtub. One of them couldn't be closed due to a broken control rod. Enter William J. Hoare, a Swedish hard hat diver working for the J.S. Bundik Submarine Company, who was assigned to perform repairs. Bill Hoare is built like a linebacker at 6'3", 240 pounds. So when he's described as wearing armor when he dons his standard diving dress, it's an apt description. And with his 10 years' experience on shipwrecks and marine salvage, this job in a freshwater lake must have seemed like it would be an easy payday. The problem area is the valve on the low-level sluiceway located under 70 feet of water. From the reservoir side, a 48-inch pipe travels through the base of the dam. On the far side is the outlet and dry ground. Halfway between is the faulty valve, stuck at 1/3 open. If it were shut, you would just be able to walk up to it from the dry side. However, with it partway opened and the control rod snapped, this was not possible. Even 1/3 open, the water jetted past the valve at some 40 miles an hour with the whole lake behind it. The game plan was this: temporarily plug the drain on the reservoir side. With the water shut off, a worker could climb safely up the sluiceway and access the valve to reconnect the control rod. And to be fair, this was a pretty sound approach. To plug the drain, a temporary wood and lead stopper was fabricated. This was a massive thing, 54 inches in diameter and weighing some 5,000 pounds. The plan was to lower it into the water by crane, and the suction near the drain should be enough to pull it the rest of the way. Hoare's job was to observe and guide it into place if necessary. Here's where things went sideways. Due to the weight of the stopper, it needed to be rigged with hawsers. A hawser is like a rope, but used to tow ocean liners. As the stopper was pulled into the drain, a length of hawser slipped between the pipe flange and the stopper, compromising the seal. The leak remained. The force on the stopper, combined with its sheer mass, was too much for Hoare to move or for the crane to pull it back up. He returned to the surface to explain the situation, since his suit was not equipped with a radio. This comes up again later. There, he collected a number of sandbags, intending to simply plug the gap. He told his surface team, John Dobson, to keep pumping the baffles, his air supply. Per Dobson's account, he warned Hoare to be careful, to which the large Swede responded by laughing through the glass of his helmet. As he descended for the last time, upon returning to the bottom of the lake, Hoare presumably went back to the stopper and attempted to insert the sandbags to plug up the leak. It's unclear exactly what happened next, only that around 4 p.m., Dobson observed Hoare's signal line tugging frantically, the signal for distress. These men had worked together for several years, and Hoare had made a point to tug his line at regular intervals to indicate he was all right. As the sun set on the evening of the 11th, Dobson knew something terrible had happened. Sure enough, when he went to pull up the line, it would not budge. Shortly after, Hoare's friend William Olson was called at his home in New York City and told of the situation. Within 2 hours, he arrived in Boonton with his gear. Midnight. Olson suited up and went to the bottom. There, he found Hoare. One of his legs had been sucked into the gap between the stopper and the pipe. He was trapped. Cautiously, Olson approached his friend, wary of the rushing current. He clasped his hand and offered comfort before ultimately returning back to the surface. Olson worked through the night. He returned with a crowbar to attempt to pry the ball off the pipe for Hoare to pull himself free of the rushing current. However, the force was just too high. This was never going to work. Not only the cold, potential injuries, and simple fatigue, But at this depth, Hoare also had to be concerned about nitrogen narcosis and other injuries related to prolonged exposure to high pressure. Remember Dr. J.L. Taylor? He was on site and prematurely declared after only a few hours that Hoare was already dead, having been in the water for nearly 8 hours by that point. While this turned out to not yet be the case, they were fighting the clock. Thus, even though it was suggested that they might simply drain the lake, it was never a real possibility. Their next attempt was to tie a rope around the stopper and pull it with a team of horses from the opposing shore. However, due to the danger of another diver potentially being sucked into the pipe same as Hoare, they weren't able to get a good fix on the stopper, and so when the horse team pulled, the rope just slipped off. Keep in mind that at this depth, the ball was being held in place with something like 27 tons of force. Likewise, attempting to raise it by crane achieved nothing. Olson returned to Hoare, and this time they tied the rope around his waist. This rescue attempt would be much more direct. They would pull and hope for the best. They slung the rope a quarter mile to the opposite shore, and 5 men pulled. Nothing happened. They tried again throughout the night, but still got nowhere. At one point, Olson tried to pry the stopper off the pipe with the crowbar again, but this time he slipped and injured his hand. He turned unresponsive, and they hauled him back to the surface, unconscious. Despite the valiant effort, Hoare remained trapped. 9 a.m. the morning of the 12th. Back on land, Olson was taken away for medical care. Thankfully, the rest of the rescue team arrived by this time. They consisted of fellow divers Peter Gilligan, Frank M. Paul, Robert Russell, and John M. Rice. By this point, a crowd of what would become thousands started to form, anxious for news about the trapped diver. Rice and the others, all experienced divers, knew they were fighting the clock. At one point, they tried a different tack and attempted to sandbag the open side of the sluiceway. However, the bags were washed away almost as quickly as they were set. John Rice took over diving for the injured Olson. By this point, Hoare's been underwater for 17 hours, and despite his impressive build and inhuman stamina, he's simply running out of energy. They decided to double down on the rope strategy and attempted to pull him free again. So, Rice headed down to the bottom and tied the rope around Hoare. This would be the last time that anyone would see him alive. 11 o'clock. On the far shore, they attached a block and tackle to a tree and pulled with a team of horses. I just need to underscore how truly desperate they must have been at this point. As someone with experience in a load-bearing harness, I can only imagine the stress that was imparted onto Hoare's body by just a simple loop of rope. One way or another, they intended to get him out of that lake, injuries be damned. This was truly a last resort. However, under load, the rope broke and the signal line went quiet. Rice dove, but Hoare was unresponsive this time. By this point, he was laying sideways, with both legs now sucked into the pipe. What Rice couldn't see was that Hoare's helmet was now filled with water, something that should not have happened with Dotson and the rest of the team pumping air through the baffles. See, a standard diving dress is supposed to be water and air tight, but what they would later find is that at some point, possibly in the initial hours of his entrapment, but likely during the last failed rescue attempt, Hoare's boot had been torn off along with the foot of his watertight diving dress, leaving it compromised. Even then, the air pumping into his helmet should allow him to continue breathing, but only so long as his head stayed above the breach. The strain on his body during the last rescue attempt probably caused him to pass out, and he could no longer keep his head up. At which point, water entered his helmet, and it was all over from there. For another 36 hours, Dobson and the others kept the baffles running. When asked, "Do you get any signal?" they replied, "No, Bill's dead. We're pumping for sentiment." Sentiment or no, they were left with the very practical issue of getting Hoare's body out of what was meant to be a city's water supply. They also needed to repair the faulty valve. As to that, the stopper had not completely blocked off the drain, but the flow had been reduced to a manageable level. John Rice, the diver who had seen Hoare alive for the last time, was also a machinist. He volunteered to enter the sluiceway with the water still rushing through it and complete the job. I just need to stress just how dangerous this was. It was another 3 days of work by the morning of the 15th of April that they were able to shut off the valve and retrieve Hoare's body. He was buried on the 18th of April, 1904, in Astoria, Queens. Peter Gilligan, Frank M. Paul, Robert Russell, and John Rice, the man who ultimately freed his body from the pipe, all served as pallbearers. Water service to Jersey City commenced a month later on the 26th of May, 1904, and continues to this day. And that's my theory for the real-life explanation behind the legend of the man supposedly drowned in the church, but in reality was a brave diver and the subject of a valiant if ultimately unsuccessful, rescue attempt. Regardless of the ultimate source of inspiration or factuality, the drowned town and the man in the church are both pieces of local lore and worthy of preservation, if for no other reason than to mess with incoming freshmen. However, neither should we lose sight of the real life drama, tragedy, and valor of those who were actually there. Before we go, I'd just like to share a few other pieces of interesting research that I came across, but I couldn't find another place in the video for it. On one occasion, 4 men were arrested for driving horses with sore breasts. I don't know, I just think animal cruelty charges is an anachronism for the early 1900s. Also, construction was interrupted when they found fish fossils at the base of the dam. In fact, there may have been more, but they were pilfered and stolen by laborers before management figured out what was going on and put a stop to it. I mentioned Flynn and the Jersey City Water Company, who ultimately won the contract, but what I didn't have time to get into was the whole series of lawsuits that resulted from it. They won despite having a higher bid because, and this is speculative, because they showed a whole bunch of photographs in court to prove that their competitors intended to use fouled water sources, things like factory and farm runoff. Just kind of sketchy. Then, when it turned out that the reservoir was polluted anyway, Flynn tried to argue that he wasn't on the hook for making a treatment plant because, according to the contract, he didn't. Naturally, Jersey City took issue with that, and there was a whole debate about how that would be handled. There was another funny moment where, during a city assembly meeting in Jersey City, someone voiced concern that the incredibly lucrative contract had been awarded unfairly, without competition. A valid concern, and in response, the entire room drowned him out with hooting and stamping so he couldn't continue. And then, when he accused them of shilling for the water company, the whole thing almost devolved into a street brawl. Politics. So that'll about wrap it up for me. If you stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. And also thanks to Arlene Dempsey, whose book was a major source for this video. She put in a lot of the research, and what she found out accounts for most of what we now know about Old Boonton. All sources in the description. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.